Okay, darling, you know how it is. Of course, darling, no one can against me. That is what you can have. That you cut one of my heads and then come through with three more. Of course, darling, so it is by me. That is what you can have. That no one can against me. You cut one of my heads and I have more. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I give you. My white rabbit, darling, of course, that is what you can have. Of course, you want the towers, of course, darling, take money, I have a lot of them, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you're gonna have fun. You're gonna have a lot of money, you want my white rabbit, you want my towers, of course, darling, you're gonna have everything you want. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you got one of my heads and you have two or three more, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that we are in hell with capital letters, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you have to let them, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that if you come with the tuning team, you have to find the capital letters and let them, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I give a them the two shotgun, you have to let that shotgun, if not, you're gonna be dumb, of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that you have to let the shotgun over them, of course, that is what you can have, if not come with a 32 maybe, of course, darling, that is what you can have, but no one can against me, of course, darling, that is what you can have, so go on. Of course, darling, that if you come with the true shotgun, you have to find the capital letters and let them. Of course, darling, you cannot stay there. That is what you can have, that you have to let them. Of course, if you come with a 32, okay, what can you say? But I prefer the tower 32, shoot myself and let them there, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that if you come with the true shotgun, you have to let them, of course, you cannot stay there, so take a 32 shotgun and forget about everything, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm with my rich bitch in here, of course, darling, the better you bring your condoms, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, of course, darling, I have my back covered, of course, darling, that is what you can have to take one with the condoms, of course, darling, forget about that, of course, darling, that is what you can have, and they come and they are the whole time after my money, of course, darling, they want my money. Of course, darling, they want my money. Of course, darling, they are the whole time after my money, running after me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. They have some people who suicide to get my money. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. They fall in love with my kids and they suicide to get my money. They are really gone. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they don't have what they should have. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they are crazy. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That they should do other things instead of killing themselves to get some money. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. And I have friends from the death guys calling my friends to get my bag. Of course, darling, they are crazy. Of course, darling, they are crazy for my money. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, but I'm gonna forget them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they are the whole time cutting my heads. Of course, but I find I grow up and I have more. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I wanna forget them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you have to let the shotgun. Of course, darling. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I have a newbies here. Of course, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that I'm in hell. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you have to find the capital letters and let them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, I got one of my hats and some more grow. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. So forget about that. You want some money, darling, I'm gonna give you the white rabbit. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. You want the tawas, of course, darling, that is what you can have. But if you come with what you're 19, you have to find the capital letters and let them. You know that, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have. But you cannot stay with the shotgun, of course, darling, that is what you can have. A 32 shotgun is the deadliest weapon in the world, of course, darling, because you have to let them. But I swear I don't wanna kill no one. They are the whole time suiciding to get my money. They fell in love with my kids and they suicide to get my money and be God, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they are crazy. Of course, darling, you got one of my hats and some more grow. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they suicide to get my money. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. So take the white rabbit, take the towers. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. I'm gonna shoot myself. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, that I love you so much. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, want the Harley, take the Harley. Of course, take the towers, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, you got one of my hats and some more grow. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that I'm gonna give you the deadliest weapon in the world, of course. Of course, darling, they fall in love with my kids and they suicide. Of course, darling, to get my money. That is what you can have. Of course, darling, they fall in love with my kids and they suicide to get my money. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna be old and have 30 grandchildren. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I wanna live. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That if you come with the 219, you have to find the capital letters and let them. And if you come with a my cross, you're shooting that at the devil. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, they suicide to get my money because they fall in love with my kids. Of course, darling, or their friends call mine to get my bag. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they are trying the whole time those things. Of course, darling, I don't want money who isn't mine. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, I have a lot of blue checks. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, you have to let the 219 with the capital letters. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That you have to leave the shotgun. Of course, darling. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna freeze the holy water. World is yours, and you have to find the capital letters and let them. Of course, darling, and if they come with a micros, they are shooting back at the devil, and they have to go to the confessionary to regret it and find the capital letters and let them. I'm gonna give you the white rabbit and the towers. Of course, darling, take the money and forget about all them. Of course, I kiss them. Bye.